Hello there, and so forgive me if I did not change this audio to mono. You might want to change your settings in listening to change the audio to mono because I'm recording with a cell phone with two speakers. So to begin, I'd like to say that what I really want to do here is focus on some myths that have been circulating the internet around flashlights. And I think that there's really three myth groups that we see a lot. All right. Most of the time, it's a myth or a misconception about ANSI or FL1 standards. Okay. ANSI standards of lighting are greatly misunderstood. And a lot of people throw them around because they don't understand what they mean. And even when they get their feet wet, they still don't really understand enough that they can talk badly about certain lights. And so we're going to talk about ANSI standards and what this meters and lumens means, which brings us into the second one, which is a misunderstanding of throw and candela and lumens, and something else we don't talk about too much, which is called lux, which is different. Lux is not candela; they have nothing to do with each other. So there's a lot of misconceptions in what's called brightness. And the third myth group where we see some misconceptions is with batteries. And so with batteries, there's a lot of misunderstandings and misgivings about how batteries work with flashlights. I need to bring another one out here. But how batteries work with flashlights and how the energy is used with various kinds of batteries. Okay, some batteries being the best, highest energy, being higher output, and then batteries that have longer run times. There's misunderstandings with how batteries work. Okay, so we're going to talk about all three kinds of myths. So first off, ANSI standards. So right here on the front of the box there isn't much, but right back here we see a bunch of these ANSI standards. So let's talk about what these mean. Now this particular flashlight actually has two mode groups. There's a mode group called power and a mode group called eco. I actually really like this, and I'll talk about why later. But there's two different options sort of for every level. The only thing I don't like about this is how low is the same and how the lumens for turbo are greatly reduced. I think it'd be okay to still have turbo power and just shift everything else down, and just get rid of this like 250 lumen mode and constrict the modes a little bit. In any case, but I like it. It's a good concept. It's a good basic concept. But we're going to ignore it. This is just a repetition of these first four symbols, which is lumens, runtime, throw, and meters, and then throw and candela, which is intensity. And then you have FL1 standard for drop test. It says 1 meter for this flashlight, which is this guy. And then it says 2 meters waterproof. Okay. There's also some small terminology I hear wrong, which also has to do with like bulletproof vests and other things like that. The word proof does not mean impenetrable. Okay, the word proof means a specified impenetrability. So when it says IPX68 waterproof 2 meters, and this is important because if it doesn't specify it and it says IPX, and it's funny because this guy, they actually messed this up. Somebody dropped the ball. They put IPX68 when what they meant to do is put IP68. Okay, what they meant to do is IP68 because IPX, the X stands for not knowing what your dust resistance is. The 6 means that it's 100% dust proof. If it's 100% dust proof, it's 6. That's the highest dust resistance. And one of the problems and why people would rather put an X there is because that's what most other flashlight brands are doing. And they also like to put an X there because 6 next to a 7 or an 8 makes it look like that 6 could have an improvement and it can't. There's no such thing as IP77, as IP67 or IP68, but there is no improvement of dust resistance over 6. Okay, the only real improvement that's ever been rated is for the Mars rovers, and that has to do with how we wanted to make things more permanently reliable in space, or there's no way to clean it or access the technology. In any case, we'll come back to that later. There's also special resistance of water that has nothing to do with flashlights, unless you're going to mount your flashlight on a vehicle and you want it to be pressure washed. Like I think there's IPX9, and that's a specific measurement. IPX9 doesn't mean it's like 1,000 meters submersible. The 9 stands for extreme resistance to pressure, and then there's a specified limit. And what it does is it is basically the angles of the water resistance don't allow high pressure water to screw up the instrument, which is usually hydraulics or something having to do with an automotive piece of equipment for the military or for mining and stuff like that, because those are always cleaned with pressure washers. Anyways, but getting back to everything else, I'm not going to talk anymore about water resistance because that's not where most of the myths reside. Other than water resistance, okay, is often not tested, and that's a different video. That's getting into like flashlights, honesty, and that kind of thing. Right now we're just going to focus on misunderstandings, and most people, it's difficult to misunderstand something that's spelled out so well. It's resistant to 2 meters for 30 minutes. Okay, they don't actually say 30 minutes on this box, but they do on the instructions. Okay, so we're not going to talk about all these, but what we will say, okay, is what these are based on. So the drop test is based on a 6-sided drop test, which means dropped on its face, dropped on the tail, dropped on this side, dropped on this side, dropped on that side, and then dropped here. For this, with the handle installed, the 6 side would matter. Otherwise, it's really just 3 sides that matter. Front, back, and then maybe 2 of the sides here and here. But oftentimes they don't drop test flashlights accurately. They just underestimate the drop test greatly. This could probably survive a drop from 2 or 3 meters as long as it hit the right angle. Okay, they just underestimate it because of this thing right here. You see this? No, you don't see that, because that is a ridiculous 97% light transference. This lens is by definition invisible. In fact, if the flashlight wasn't there and you take one of these lenses in your hand, you literally can't see the lens. You can see the lens bend light around, but by definition, it's invisible. You actually can't see it. Now, without a lot of light, okay, you could see it reflect light, and you can tell that it's there, which is similar to how like an invisible man would work if you were wearing camouflage, like the camouflage that's used for Predator, okay? But it's by definition, it's invisible. This lens, you can't see this lens. It's treated with anti-reflective coatings and everything. And even when I reflect this light, okay, right there, off of it, that light is way, way, way dimmer than it is when we look directly at it. Okay, you can even tell on the camera, like, yeah, you can see the light there, and it looks brighter on camera than it does to my eyes. But when you directly look at it, bam, look at that. So it's like hundreds of times less bright than it is. Anyways, and there's also anti-reflective on the inside, so that the LED's light doesn't bounce back into the LED. More than 95% doesn't bounce back. So moving on. So you have to understand that drop test is usually vastly underestimated. Most flashlights can withstand at least 1 or 2 drops from between 3 or 4 times to all the way as much as 10 or 20 times higher. There's O lights and Phoenix lights that have been thrown up into the air like 10 meters, 12 meters multiple times, and they still work if they come down and hit asphalt. The other thing what we do want to mention with drop testing is that drop testing actually absolutely has to be done on concrete. Okay, which is the other thing. If you drop a flashlight onto dirt, you should be able to drop it from 30 meters. It's not going to break the flashlight. If you drop it on asphalt, it's going to be a little bit more likely to work than concrete. And dropping it on wood or carpet or indoor surfaces is definitely, it should work. Okay, even a big boy like this. Now this thing's lens is more likely to crack or break, which is why they say just 1 meter. If you drop it from 1 meter on concrete right on these, there's still going to be a chance that this lens will crack. So you got to be careful with that kind of flashlight. But anything smaller or with a TIR optic, TIR optics are polycarbonate, and there's usually little to no glass involved, and so they're actually much more formidable. But enough of that. That's the only myth. This has nothing to do with reality. This is vastly underestimated, typically speaking. I've done all kinds of drops with flashlights. One thing I broke has been batteries and a tail cap on one of my O lights. In any case, so right here we say lumens. Lumens are interesting. Okay. These measurements, not so much those don't matter, that waterproof, whatever. But these measurements, the lighting measurements, are based on early 1900s flashlights. Okay, 1900s to the 1960s, really, 1970s. That's what it was based on. Before HID, before powerful incandescent flashlight, we had weak incandescence. And what happens with those? A couple things. One is they take about 10 to 20 seconds to warm up. So the reason why you measure lumens at 30 seconds is actually not because the lighting decreases. It's because you want to give it ample time for the light to reach its output. This is very true even today with HID flashlights. It's very different than LEDs. LEDs can get very bright, but they have a thermal problem where their own heat kind of destroys them. So they have to be backed off, or else they will melt themselves. Okay, and this is a 3000 lumen LED that's put in here. So when it's driven to 6300 or whatever it actually is, and we're going to get into that part of the myth in a moment, because there's some huge misunderstandings with third-party calculations on lumens. But lumens are not brightness. That might be the biggest myth out there. Lumens are actually a measurement of output. We used to use watts because with filaments, watts was also output. If it put out 10 watts, it put out 10 lumens, and if it put out 30 watts, it put out 30 lumens. Okay, and that's not completely true, but basically. So today, LEDs are much more efficient than other filaments, but even within LEDs, we have different levels of efficiency. And this LED actually is interesting because it's not very efficient. It has an efficiency of I think it's about 24%. Lumens, the lumens per watt is down around 100. The most efficient is the XHP 50.2 and 70.2 LEDs, even to date. Okay, no luminous LED is as efficient as those two Crees. And the 50.2 and 70.2 both have an efficiency of around 180 lumens per watt, which is really actually phenomenal. Okay, because you can take a AA or AAA battery and put out 1 or 2 watts and get 150, potentially as high as 300 lumens out of a AA battery. In fact, I think the best AA battery ever, using an energizer lithium, and we'll come back to what that is, because that has to do with the energy myth, the third myth. Okay, but this myth of what brightness is lumens is not brightness. Okay, but we're going to come back to that. That's the second myth. Okay, let me keep it in order here. We have ANSI standard myths, brightness myth, and then battery myth. but ANSI myth. So lumens are measured at 30 seconds because light's used to warm up. And then the other thing is the runtime is based on going down to 10% of the original brightness. So say we have 2500 lumens, and once it gets down to 250 lumens, once it gets down, 2500, once it gets down to 250 lumens, then we measure it. Now, there's a lot of myths surrounding that ANSI standard truth, including the myth that lights like the one you see in front of me, this guy, go down for certain to 250. Okay, it's not necessarily true. In fact, ACE beams are known for flat regulation. So these lower modes, especially these three, or maybe this one, I'm not sure. These four modes, okay, they're going to put that out for the entire runtime that they say. And the high mode has a little bit of a fluctuation. Okay, this high mode actually is pretty static. And there's actually a chart online for this, but disappointingly, they don't have one on the box, nor in the instructions. I just checked on my instructions. They might change that in the future. Even my instructions don't show you the curves, but online, they actually show you the curves for some of these, and then you can look up third-party testing, which shows similar results. The 2500 lumen mode comes on and stays on for a very long time. And I believe that when this flashlight, correct me if I'm wrong, but when this flashlight goes down to 2 hours or so, out of the 2 hours, 15 minutes, when it's getting close to going dark, it will briefly come down to like 1250 lumens, and then it will go dark. All right, not like these four. Now, I've never run this flashlight anywhere near all the way down, so I'm going to talk about a different flashlight now. But my suspicion is that once these get down pretty much all the way to zero, it just turns off, and it doesn't really warn you that it's turning off, other than this thing right here. Okay, this green light, which in real life is a much more pleasant green than it is on this display. I don't know if that's my display or if it's the camera. Let me see if I can't. That's weird. It does not look all pale like that. In real life, that's a very solid green. In any case, now, when this thing runs low, it turns red, and when it gets really low, the red light then flashes. Okay, so it does give you a warning, but it doesn't mess around with the output. So the 7 lumen does not go down to 7/10 of a lumen after one day and then hold that for 6.5 days. Okay, on this flashlight. There are flashlights that do that. So there are lights out there that will say, oh, they have a 7 lumen ultra low mode, okay, or moonlight mode, and then it lasts for, let's just say it says 20 days, but for the first 2 days, it goes down to, say, 1 lumen or half of a lumen, and then just holds that half lumen for 16 days. And that's an unrealistic representation of that flashlight's capabilities. This is actually too realistic. So this is actually kind of underestimating how strong this light's efficiency is, because it's saying 5 hours, 15 minutes at 1250 lumens. But most flashlights that put out that many lumens, they don't, when they say, let's say they say it's, let's say, for example, let's pick on, I think there's an Olight out there that puts out 1,000. Actually, let's pick on Phoenix. Phoenix has a light that does, I think it's 800 lumens for like 5 hours. But it isn't. It starts at 800 lumens, and then at some point it decides to, based on the battery voltage, or maybe it's a timer, but something decides to kick it down to 650 lumens, which is close enough to 800 that you think it hasn't really changed. With your eyes, you can't really tell the difference, but it's low enough compared to 650 is 150 lumens lower than 800, which really makes it a bad comparison to this flashlight, for example, because you're talking about going from 800, which is close to 1250, to like half the 650, which is like half of 1250. So doing that for 5 hours and 30 minutes, which is what it does, isn't competitive with this because this holds this real solid. The other thing is it's during its very last hour, it actually kicks it down even further. It goes down to like, I think it's like 400 lumens to kind of warn you that the light's running out of power. There's an advantage to that, which we'll come back to. But the fact is, Phoenix lights tend to shelf down. And there's 4 different ways that flashlight companies do it. You ready for this? The first way the first thing we're going to talk about is the extreme changers. Extreme changers mostly include turbo runtime. So this 1 hour 45 minutes is based on really. This is also 1 hour 45 minutes, but it's half the amount of lumens. Why? Because it's actually about the same amount of lumens. Okay, this goes down. These both go down actually to 2,500 lumens, and they last a little bit less long than the 2 hour and 15 minutes. You see what I'm saying? So both these flashlights. I thought the light was on. Anyways, both these flashlights, they go down to 2,500 lumens. And both modes, 3,000 and 6,300, don't last as long as 2 hours and 15 minutes because before they go down to 2,500 lumens, they spend a lot of time above 2,500 lumens. That's why I get 30 minutes less of runtime, even though it levels out to around 2,500. 3,000 lasts a lot longer than the 6,300, so that's why they have the same output. The 3000 spends about, I think it's about 15 minutes, 25 minutes or so, which is a long time, 500 lumens brighter than 2500. So this guy spends 30 minutes or so, less than 30 minutes, above 2500, and then it slowly fizzles down to 2500. 6300 is very different. It lasts for about a minute, and then it goes all the way down to a little less than 3000. And then it actually goes down slightly below 2,500 and then comes back up. Because that kicks the voltage down so much with the batteries never come back up, and so it continues to drain. In other words, if you run Eco's turbo, once it runs out of power, you probably can't really turn the light back on. But if you run this one, okay, the turbo with the higher setting, once that flashlight turns off, you can probably turn it back on because the voltage will come back up a little bit. That's complicated information, but you got to understand how complicated flashlights are. So that's the most common thing is you have this turbo output and it poof goes down and then holds that for a long time, and then it goes down from there. The second regulation is what's called flat, which we already talked about. So like 1250 lumens on this light. With my experience, ace beams, especially my L30, this one I know for certain because I looked at it with ambient lighting for a really long time, and at 1000 lumens it never changed brightness. Okay, and when I run out of power, you have a very bad negative, which is it just turns off, which sucks. You know, it has an element of suck to it because the L30 does have a indication of its power. Doesn't have an indication of its power. So when the L30 Gen 2 ace beam runs out of energy, you have no idea. You don't see it coming. It just turns off. That can be a bad thing. With these, that's mitigated by the warning light. So at least you have something letting you know, hey, I'm about to run out of energy, when the output maintains at a constant level, which I personally, I really prefer that. I really prefer it maintaining the same. Then Phoenix does something interesting. It maintains the same for a long time, and then it shelves itself down on purpose. Now, it's not because of heat, and it isn't because the battery cannot maintain. So this is huge. This goes into the second thing, which is an ANSI standard. Or the third thing I was going to talk about, which is batteries and efficiency. But flashlights do not go down in output because the battery cannot put out the same amount of lumens. That's BS, and that's circling the internet. Flashlights reduce in output because they are either too hot or because they're choosing to reduce in output on purpose in order to give your eyes a cue. Or number 3, they go down in output because they're choosing to in order to make the batteries last longer. But it's never because the batteries can't push the light. Okay, most batteries in flashlights today can break the LED if the driver was designed to do that on purpose. Okay, obviously that's not useful, so it's designed to not break the ILED. So moving on with ANSI standards, the third kind of regulation after shelving, so you have flat, well actually this is the fourth. So you have turbo regulation, which is 6,000 lumens for a minute, and then shooting down to 2,500 and holding that for the rest of the hour and 44 minutes. Then you have flat regulation, so this 250 mode comes on, it just holds that the entire time, and then it just turns off. And then the third kind is like purposeful reductions to let you know and to also make the batteries last longer. Phoenix lights, let's say it's 800 lumens, and it shelves itself down to 650 after, say, 30 minutes for 5 hours runtime. The first 30 minutes, 800, and then the next 4.5 hours, 650. And actually usually shelves one more time or even two more times down to lower output. So 650 down to 400 for an hour or so, and then down to 20 to kind of let you really know, hey, I'm about to turn off for like 12 more minutes, and that turns off. Some sneaky companies will use shelving outputs to make these runtimes much higher than they should be. For example, let's say it says 1,000 lumens for 10 hours. Okay, 1,000 lumens for 10 hours on a single 18650. Yeah, that doesn't exist. It's going to be 1,000 lumens for about a minute, then it's going to crash down to 200, and then it might crash all the way down to 100 lumens and literally hold that for 9 hours. Okay, and then turn off. So, sometimes also it's important to note that ANSI standard isn't the same thing as total runtime. And some flashlights at the end, they'll start flashing, but they won't actually turn off for you. You'll wait until the protective circuit in the battery turns the flashlight off for you. And other flashlights will go down to a lower mode than 10% of the original output, and that won't be considered in this runtime, but it is important to consider. So say it comes on at 1250, it isn't true that at 5 hours and 15 minutes this thing will just be dead. What I can do is I can turn it off right at 5 hours and 15 minutes. I can turn it off before it turns itself off, hopefully, with fresh batteries. And I can turn it on in the ultra low, and I'll still get maybe 3 or 4 or 5 hours out of the batteries, which is enough. It's called a bailout mode, and we'll come back to that in another video. In any case, so the final way that you'll see regulation happen is a curved regulation. This is, I don't know how many this is, 4 or 5, but it's where it goes down and then it curves. Okay, and it's a smooth curve, but it isn't the same thing as a shelf, because it's not holding outputs. It's just continuing to reduce output. Direct drive flashlights work that way, and we'll come back to what direct drive is in another video. So it starts up here, it goes down, it goes down, it goes down, and then it starts to hold a little bit longer, but it never holds the same output, and it's less reliable. Like MSRD4, for example, the version 1, that's how those flashlights work, and I hate it. I cannot use MSRs. I just lost my MSRD4 flashlight recently, and I don't miss it as much as you'd think. Even though it's a $90 titanium version, I don't miss it that much, because I don't really use it that often, because it has this curved output that just continues to sink in a curved manner. It never holds, so it's very annoying, because you'll see it kick down and kick down like it's tiny shelves, really tiny shelves. In fact, not all, but most curved flashlights, they're going to be tiny little shelves, and it shelves down, and I shelf down again, and I shelf down again. But when you zoom out, okay, it's just a curve. It's just an unrigid curve without ever holding the same output. And I really despise that kind of elimination. We're going to talk about throw in just a minute, but throw comes from candela. And candela is, and we'll talk about this with the second myth in just a moment, but candela is actually brightness, not lumens. Lumens have nothing to do with brightness. Lumens do not matter. Okay, perceived brightness, lumens matter sort of when there's a big, huge change. You can tell that there's less light, but that's different than brightness. Excuse that interruption. Okay, so candela is true brightness. So 1,562,000 candela. Brief interruption there. In any case, so candela is real brightness, right? But we'll come back to that because that's myth number 2. And there's a lot of misconceptions about that. But what we really want to focus on here is, I should probably split these videos up. This is a much more solid measurement than this, which rubs into myth number 2, but we're still going to go on this. 6,300 lumens is a little bit of a questionable figure. This figure is not questionable because it's easier to measure. With this figure right here called 1.5 million candela, it is not, that is measured with a single lux meter, and it is an easy measurement. The 6,300 lumens, however, is measured with at least 2 or 3 lux meters professionally. Non-professionally, and this gets into myth number 2, there's a lot of third parties that think that, like, the Texas Instruments, the Lumen Tube, and like these other things, or what is it called? Ace Instruments? Anyways, there's these hardware store, like tubular PVC pipe BS tools that attempt to measure lumens of flashlights. And we'll get into number 2 later, but lumens are not easy to measure. And there's a lot of inaccurate information, including one of the most common myths I hear, which is that lumens, especially in candle power forums with people who are semi-professional, they understand lumens, and they still say something that's really ignorant. They say that lumens are relatively accurate when they're measured with the same device. And that's just far from the truth, especially if you're only using 1 lux meter. We'll come back to that in the second myth. But candela is not something difficult to measure. Candela is measured easily. Okay? And it's an absolute measurement that everyone can agree on quickly and easily, because you just need a lux meter and you just need to calculate it from far away. Now, there's a way to measure this. Candela and throw, and now candela is the intensity of lux measured from 1 meter, but technically speaking, you don't take the measurement at 1 meter, and this flashlight does not give me 1.5 million lux if it's 3 feet away from my face. It's probably more like 600,000 or maybe a little bit less than that. What it gives me is 1.5 million candela calculated from farther away. But it never gives you that intense of a figure. And for example, if I take this number and I calculate it from 1 inch away, it's hypothetically, it's like 2.4 million candela, but